This isn't a story of glorious battles or shining crowns. No, this is something far grimier, something that seeps into your bones like damp rot. Welcome to Grim Chronicles, where we rip away the polished veneer of history to expose the decay beneath. Today, we're diving into the chilling tale of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled half the world only to be undone by the very blood they cherished. At the heart of this tragedy is a princess whose presence cleared rooms and a king who could barely hold a throne, let alone an empire. Let's walk into the shadows and uncover their story. Picture yourself in the heart of the Spanish court, where every glance is calculated, every word a potential trap. The Habsburgs have ruled here for over 2 centuries, their empire sprawling from the silver mines of the Americas to the spice routes of the Philippines. Gold pours into their coffers, their armies cast long shadows across Europe, and their name alone commands awe. But something is wrong. You can feel it in the way the courtiers avert their eyes, the way the servants hurry past certain rooms. The chandeliers gleam, but their light can't hide the truth. This mighty dynasty is rotting from within. Behind those ornate doors, a secret festers, one that will bring down the most powerful family Europe has ever known. This isn't a tale of swords or revolutions. It's not about invaders breaching the walls or peasants storming the gates. No, this is a story of something far more sinister, a slow, strangling the life out of their bloodline. Let's meet Princess Margarita Teresa, born in 1651, a girl who should have been the jewel of European royalty. She was the daughter of King Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece, a hint of the darkness we're about to explore. In the portraits of Diego Velázquez, Margarita is a vision. Golden curls, delicate features, the perfect princess destined for greatness. Her hand was sought by kings and emperors. Her marriage meant to seal alliances that would shape the continent. But the reality was far uglier. By her teens, Margarita was a living tragedy. Her presence marked not by grace or charm, but by something far more disturbing. When she entered a room, people didn't bow, they fled. It wasn't her manners or her demeanor that drove them away. It was the smell. Not a faint whiff of unwashed silk or neglected hygiene, but an odor so overpowering it could make your eyes water from across the hall. Courtiers, hardened by years of courtly pretense, couldn't hide their disgust. No amount of rose water. From the moment he was born, it was clear he was different, frail, deformed, barely able to function. The Habsburgs had created a genetic nightmare. Priests declared the royal family's afflictions a divine challenge, a test of their worthiness to rule. Exorcisms were performed when strange behaviors appeared, as if demons, not genes, were to blame. It was a perfect storm of ignorance and ideology, and Margarita was caught in its center. Her life was a study in isolation. By her teens, she knew the effect she had on others. Imagine being raised to believe you're the pinnacle of royalty, only to see people recoil from you. No perfume could hide the odor that defined her, a symptom of a body breaking down under the strain of its own bloodline. Social gatherings were restructured to keep her at a distance. Diplomatic receptions became exercises in avoidance, all while maintaining the facade of royal dignity. She was meant to be Spain's shining star, but instead, she was a prisoner, trapped in a body that betrayed her and a court that couldn't face the truth. And then there was Carlos, the boy who would become king. His condition was even more dire, a stark warning of what was to come. He didn't walk until he was 4. His speech was garbled, his body a patchwork of deformities. The Habsburg jaw, a genetic quirk that had grown worse with each generation, reached its grotesque peak in him. His lower jaw jutted so far he could barely close his mouth, making eating and speaking a struggle. His tongue was too large, his head oversized, his limbs uncoordinated. Seizures, likely epilepsy, plagued him, and his health was so fragile that physicians lived in fear of his death, creating elaborate protocols to mask his limitations. Tutors tried to teach him statecraft, but he struggled with basic concepts. Ceremonies were choreographed to limit his role, reducing him to a silent figurehead while advisors pulled the strings. Foreign diplomats, ever watchful, saw through the charade. Venetian ambassadors described him as a shadow of a king. French courtiers noted the court's efforts to hide his condition, and English spies speculated about his lifespan. Spain's rivals weren't just watching. They were planning, waiting for the moment when the Habsburgs' empire would be theirs for the taking. The Spanish court was a world of pretense, but the cracks were impossible to hide. The empire that had once struck fear into Europe was faltering, its rulers too frail to lead. Margarita's suffering and Carlos's frailty were more than personal tragedies. They were symptoms of a dynasty in collapse. The Habsburgs had built their power on the idea that their blood was sacred, but that blood was now their poison. The court buzzed with whispers, not just of scandal, but of something deeper. A creeping dread that the empire itself was rotting. The air was thick with it, a stench that no amount of incense could mask, carrying the weight of a dynasty's doom. That stench wasn't just in the air, it was in the blood, coursing through the veins of a family that had pushed nature too far. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity wasn't unique to Spain, but nowhere else was it pursued with such relentless devotion. What began as a strategy to consolidate power had become a death spiral, a genetic experiment that turned their family into a cautionary tale. By the late 17th century, using marriages to build an empire that spanned continents. Their wealth poured in from the New World: silver from Mexico, gold from Peru, spices from Asia. Their armies were unmatched. Their navy ruled the seas, and their influence stretched from Vienna to Manila. But every plan has its limits, and the Habsburgs found theirs in the most intimate way: their own genes. By the 16th century, the Spanish Habsburgs had taken their strategy to an extreme. While their Austrian cousins occasionally married outside the family, the Spanish saw any outsider as a threat to their divine mandate. They believed their blood carried a sacred quality, a spark that made them uniquely suited to rule. So they married within their own ranks, cousins, nieces, aunts, creating a family tree that looked more like a closed loop than a branching structure. Each generation, the gene pool shrank. The risks grew. You don't need a modern biology textbook to know that diversity is the key to health, but the Habsburgs weren't listening to nature. They were listening to their priests, their courtiers, and their own pride. The consequences were written in the bodies of their children. Birth defects became common: twisted limbs, weak hearts, fragile minds. Mental disabilities emerged, subtle at first, then undeniable. The Habsburg jaw, a quirk that started as a minor trait, grew more pronounced, distorting faces and making speech and eating difficult. These weren't just cosmetic issues. They were signs of a deeper collapse. Yet the court refused to see it. They called these afflictions divine tests, challenges to be overcome with faith and prayer. The idea that their sacred bloodline was the problem was unthinkable, a heresy that could cost lives. The physicians were trapped. These were learned men, the best of their time, but they were powerless against the weight of royal ideology. They could see the patterns: sickly children, frail heirs, but suggesting inbreeding as the cause was too dangerous. Instead, they turned to the tools they had: bloodletting, herbal remedies, exotic potions from the colonies. None of it worked because the problem wasn't in the remedies, it was in the blood. But admitting that would have meant questioning the foundation of Habsburg rule, so they stayed silent, their notes later becoming chilling evidence of the dynasty's decline. The Catholic Church was complicit, too. Spain was a deeply religious nation, and the Church was woven into every aspect of royal life. The Habsburgs' marriage practices were sanctified by religious doctrine, framed as a sacred duty to preserve a divinely chosen bloodline. When children were born weak or deformed, her frailty, the offers dried up. Diplomats resorted to deception, downplaying her health while emphasizing Spain's power. It was a losing battle. The truth always came out, and Margarita's prospects dwindled, leaving her trapped in a court that both pitied and feared her. Carlos's condition was even more alarming. His deformities were impossible to ignore. A jaw so pronounced it distorted his face, a body so frail he seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. His seizures grew worse with age, his mind clouded by cognitive delays that made learning a struggle. The court tried to mold him into a king, but it was like trying to sculpt marble with a feather. Tutors drilled him in statecraft, but he could barely grasp the basics. Advisors whispered strategies, only to watch them slip away. The empire needed a leader, but all it had was a boy trapped in a broken body, waiting for the moment when the Habsburgs' empire would be theirs for the taking. The court was a stage, and the world was watching, ready to pounce on a kingdom that could no longer defend itself. The stage was set for collapse, and the empire was feeling the strain. Spain's court was a world of pretense, but the cracks were spreading beyond the palace walls. The empire that had once dominated Europe was faltering, its rulers too frail to lead. Margarita's suffering and Carlos's frailty were symptoms of a deeper rot, one that threatened not just the royal family but the entire nation. The Habsburgs had built their power on the idea that their blood was sacred, but that blood was now their poison, and its effects were rippling outward. By the late 17th century, the empire was a shadow of its former self. The gold still flowed from the New World, the armies still marched, but the heart of Spain, the royal family, was failing. The court was a maze of protocol and denial, where truth was buried under layers of ceremony. Carlos, too, thrust onto the throne at 4 years old, was a king in name only. His physical deformities were shocking. A jaw so pronounced it made eating a spectacle, a body so frail he could barely stand. His seizures, likely epileptic, grew worse with age, and his cognitive limitations made governance a farce. The court went to extraordinary lengths to hide his weaknesses, staging ceremonies where his role was limited to sitting still and looking regal. This wasn't just about appearances, it was about survival. Spain faced threats from all sides, French armies eyeing its borders, English and Dutch ships challenging its trade routes, colonial governors growing restless in the Americas. These problems demanded strong leadership, but Carlos was no leader. His father, Philip IV, was himself a product of inbreeding, his health and judgment compromised. When he died in 1665, Carlos inherited a throne he couldn't understand, under a regency that struggled to hold the empire together. Advisors and ministers stepped into the void, making decisions in the name of a king who couldn't comprehend them. These advisors were men of ambition, navigating a court where power was up for grabs. Without a strong monarch, factions formed, each vying for control. Some were loyal to Spain, others to their own interests. They operated in the shadows, issuing orders under Carlos's name while knowing he'd never grasp their implications. Foreign ambassadors learned to bypass the king, dealing with the real power brokers. It was a dangerous situation, leaving Spain vulnerable to internal scheming and external predation. The empire was vast, but it was starting to feel like a hollow shell, ready to collapse at the slightest push. The military felt the strain most acutely. Spain's armies and navies had once been legendary, their victories etched in history, but by now they were struggling. Commanders needed clear orders, strategic vision, a monarch who could rally the troops. Instead, they had Carlos, a king who couldn't ride a horse or review his troops without risking a seizure. Experienced officers took on roles that should have belonged to the king, and foreign spies took note, reporting that Spain's military was only as strong as its weakest link, the monarch himself. The economy was bleeding, too. Spain's wealth came from its colonies, but managing that wealth required skill and foresight. Trade policies needed to adapt, colonial administrators needed guidance, and the treasury needed oversight. But with the royal family consumed by health crises, these systems faltered. Merchants operated without direction, colonial governors acted like independent warlords, and the bureaucracy ground to a halt. Rival powers, England, France, the Netherlands, saw their chance. They developed strategies to exploit Spain's weaknesses, raiding its trade routes and stirring unrest in its colonies. The empire was hemorrhaging, and the royal family's genetic crisis was the wound that wouldn't close. Religion played a cruel role in this tragedy. The Catholic Church, Spain's moral and political anchor, justified the Habsburgs' marriage practices as a sacred duty. When Carlos's seizures grew worse, priests suggested exorcisms, claiming demonic possession might be the cause. When Margarita's condition baffled physicians, religious authorities spoke of spiritual trials. These explanations deflected blame from the royal marriage practices, framing suffering as divine will. The Spanish Inquisition, ever vigilant, even investigated theories of foreign curses or witchcraft, adding paranoia to an already tense court. The idea that the Habsburgs' problems were man-made was unthinkable. Better to blame the devil than face the truth. The international stage was a chessboard, and Spain was losing pieces. Foreign courts had been watching the Habsburgs decline for decades, their diplomats filing detailed reports about Margarita's odor, Carlos's deformities, and the court's desperate attempts to hide them. These reports weren't gossip, they were intelligence used to plan for the day when the Habsburg line would fail. That day was coming, and everyone knew it. Carlos's inability to produce an heir was the talk of Europe, turning marriage negotiations into a grim farce. Potential brides were offered lavish dowries to offset the risks of marrying into a diseased bloodline, but even money couldn't hide the truth. Spain's diplomats negotiated from weakness, promising gold they could barely afford to secure alliances that wouldn't last. The colonies were a ticking time bomb. Governors in the Americas and Asia, left without direction from Madrid, began acting independently. Some hoarded wealth, others negotiated with foreign powers, and a few flirted with rebellion. The English and Dutch exploited this, offering support to disgruntled colonists in exchange for trade concessions. The empire's unity was fraying, and the royal family's inability to provide leadership was the breaking point. Every decision, every policy was colored by the knowledge that the monarchy was failing, and with it the empire itself. Margarita's life ended in 1673, at just 21. Her body, worn out by the genetic defects she carried, finally gave out. The official cause of death was vague. Fever, perhaps, or exhaustion, but those who knew her understood the truth. She was a victim of her family's ambition. Her body a battleground for a war they didn't know they were fighting. Her funeral was a spectacle, a display of royal piety that masked a collective sigh of relief. Margarita was gone, but her death sharpened the spotlight on Carlos, the last hope of a doomed dynasty. The court turned its desperate gaze to him, praying he could somehow defy the odds and save the Habsburg line. The odds were against him. Carlos's reign was a slow-motion disaster, a kingdom held together by pretense and prayer. His health deteriorated with each passing year, his seizures more frequent, his mind less capable. Marriage negotiations for him were even more desperate than for Margarita. The court needed an heir, but his disabilities made that unlikely. Brides were chosen not for love or politics, but for their willingness to take on a hopeless task. The dowries grew larger, the promises more extravagant, but the outcome was always the same. No children, no future. Foreign spies watched every move, reporting on Carlos's health, his wife's health, even the intimate details of their marriage. The fate of Europe hung on the question of who would inherit Spain's throne. The world was closing in and Spain was running out of time. Carlos's reign was a study in futility, a kingdom propped up by illusions while its enemies sharpened their knives. The empire's challenges, rival powers, colonial unrest, economic decline, demanded a leader, but all Spain had was a king who could barely stand. The court's elaborate protocols couldn't hide the truth forever, and the world was ready to act when the inevitable came. That inevitable moment arrived in 1700, when Carlos too died at the age of 39. His body, ravaged by decades of illness, finally gave out. The official cause was vague, consumption, perhaps, but the scars of their failure would linger for centuries. The empire that had once dominated the world was diminished, its colonies vulnerable, its power a shadow of what it had been. But this story doesn't end with a war or a new dynasty. The Habsburgs' collapse left a legacy that stretches far beyond politics. Their meticulous records, court physicians' notes, diplomatic reports, even the portraits that tried to mask their flaws, became a treasure trove for later generations. When modern genetics emerged, The Habsburgs became a case study in what happens when a population becomes too insular. Scientists studying their DNA found mutations that had accumulated over generations, confirming what some 17th-century observers had suspected. Inbreeding was a recipe for ruin. The Habsburg jaw, once a proud symbol, became a textbook example of genetic drift, a warning about the dangers of a closed gene pool. This wasn't just a lesson for scientists. Royal families across Europe took note, rethinking their marriage strategies. The obsession with blood purity faded, replaced by alliances that prioritized genetic diversity over ideological rigidity. The Spanish Habsburgs, once the pinnacle of royal ambition, became a cautionary tale, their story told in palaces and classrooms alike. Their tragedy reshaped not just royal policy but the way societies thought about heredity and health. The physical remnants of their reign are still with us. Their palaces, like the Alcazar in Madrid, stand as monuments to their wealth and ambition, but also to their failure, showing how a family's pride led to its destruction. The Habsburg story speaks to our modern world, too. Today, we grapple with questions about genetic engineering, reproductive technology, and the ethics of manipulating human DNA. The Habsburgs were, in their own way, conducting a genetic experiment, one driven by ideology rather than science. Their failure is a reminder of the risks we face when we try to control nature without understanding it. Geneticists still study their case. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about the Habsburgs' fall or what grim story you want to hear next. Hit that subscribe button and join Grim Chronicles for more tales that uncover the shadows of the past. Until next time, keep your eyes on the darkness. It's where the truth hides.